Hello there, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. So sometimes the results of a study are affected by the selection of the sample, the people who are actually studied. How does that work? There's two kinds of sampling bias. Today, let's just talk about the first, selection bias. Selection bias is a systematic difference between people who are invited to participate and the population of interest. Selection bias is produced essentially by the scientists. It's produced by the process of identifying and selecting potential subjects. What do I mean by that? What selections does the scientist make? Well, remember, of course, the foundation of the sampling process. We have a population of interest, something that the scientist is interested in theoretically or generally, and it might be something very big, like I might be interested in parents of newborns. But parents of newborns, that's a huge population. The first thing that happens in the sampling process is that the scientist identifies a sampling frame. We identify a group of parents of infants from whom we are going to try to draw participants. And that might be as simple as parents of infants who live in the same city I do. But sometimes the sampling frame is much more specific. Maybe I'm going to look at parents who gave birth to a baby in the last 12 months in a particular hospital, and that might be the sampling frame. But the scientist has to pick essentially a place from which to draw subjects. That process of choosing a sampling frame is one of the first things that produces selection bias. There's always selection bias attached to the selection of a sampling frame. Some of them, as I've just implied, are purely geographical. If I'm living in Fresno, California, and I do my research in Fresno, California, then my samples are biased to Fresno, California. Sometimes the sampling frame is broader than one hospital or even one city, but there's always some kind of geographical bias. In the literature, in psychology specifically, we know that many samples come from the United States. More than half of our samples come from the United States. So a lot of what we know about psychology comes from one geographical location. So geographical bias is one problem. Related is the concept of a WIERD sample. WIERD meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So even if we're not quite as bad as getting all of our samples from one country, the vast majority of research on social relationships comes from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. So there's a WIERD bias in a lot of the research that's done in HDFS and other areas of social science. Finally, there's something called the college sophomore problem. This is because a lot of universities have a college level intro psych class, and students in that class are required to participate in research. And scientists at that institution will use that lower division psychology class to recruit subjects for studies. And so it's an easy way to get participants in research. They're already in college, they're sitting in the classrooms, they're required to do research. And so there's a lot of research that uses college sophomores, that selects a sampling frame of college sophomores. And so a lot of our information in the social sciences comes from college sophomores in WIERD countries, and particularly in the city where the researcher lives. So these are all selection biases that are related to sampling frame. Something else that the scientist has to select, which may or may not produce more selection bias, is from within the sampling frame, they have to figure out how to pick participants. There's two basic approaches. They could use a probabilistic or random approach to sampling, or they could use a non-probabilistic, non-random approach to sampling. A probabilistic or a random strategy would be simple random sampling or stratified random sampling. These are the ones used most often. Essentially, with a random procedure, every member of the sampling frame has an equal chance of being invited to participate. So this is possible when the scientist has a list of all of the people who are in the sampling frame. Now, notice that doesn't always happen, but for probabilistic or random sampling, you have to have a list of everyone who's in that group. And then you randomly pick names out. That's the essence of it. So everyone in the sampling frame has an equal chance of being selected. Random sampling or probabilistic sampling does not produce any further selection bias. We don't do it very often, though, in HDFS. We're more likely to use a non-probabilistic or a non-random sampling strategy. These include things like convenience sampling, where the scientist studies the people who he or she has access to in the course of their life. So if I want to study college students, I might study the college students who are enrolled in my class. That's very convenient for me. Or sometimes we use something called voluntary response sampling, where we put up a flyer or we put up a notice on Facebook and say, I'm looking for people who meet this certain criterion, and get in touch with me if you'd like to participate in my study. That's voluntary response. These are all non-probabilistic, non-random. People in the sampling frame don't really have an equal chance of being selected. Usually the scientist doesn't even really know who they are. We don't have a list of names. We're putting up our flyers in hopes of finding them, but we don't know who they were before then. This is more often what happens in HDFS. This does produce a selection bias because not everyone in the sampling frame is equally likely to be invited. People are obviously have more of a chance of being invited if their paths intersect with mine in some way. Let's say maybe I put up flyers in my building on my campus, and so they're more likely to see my flyer and respond to it if they are in a major that has classes in this building. You see, it's not at all random. There are these biases built in, and these biases produce selection bias. So in HDFS, selection bias is always present as a result of selecting the sampling frame. That is inevitable. That's true of every study. In HDFS, we don't tend to use random sampling strategies very often, so we typically have some more selection bias that comes from our use of non-random sampling strategies. There is one exception that I will mention, and that is sometimes we use data that comes from the federal government, especially if we are looking at prevalence data. We want to know birth rates, marriage rates, divorce rates, prevalence of child abuse. We want to know prevalence of things. We might go to federal data that uses representative samples, and those are data sets that have been constructed by simple random sampling or stratified random sampling of the entire country. So when you see that term, it's a representative sample, especially if it says a nationally representative sample, then you know what they're talking about. They have selected the entire country as the sampling frame, and they have used a random sampling strategy, and so they have greatly reduced selection bias.